Before we dive into the story of Nicodemo Scarfo, Philly's most paranoid don, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting true crime story. If you're fascinated by Mafia history and want more deep dives into the underworld, make sure to like the video and comment below with your thoughts on Scarfo's rise and fall. I'd love to hear your take on how power and paranoia destroyed one of the most feared men in the business. Now, let's get started. It was just past midnight when Nicodemo Scarfo stepped onto the boardwalk of Atlantic City, his boots making barely a sound on the wet planks. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow across the scene, and the city, still buzzing from the legalizing of casinos, was restless, but Scarfo was anything but. His mind raced, his eyes darted. His paranoia was the only thing that kept him alive in this world. He'd built an empire, yes, but it was one held together by fear, by silence. In the shadows of the flickering neon lights, Scarfo didn't look like the man who controlled the city's underworld. He wasn't flashy, didn't crave the limelight. But his power was absolute, silent, and pervasive. He watched as the crowds moved around him, never once feeling as if he could trust any of them. The people passing by didn't know it, but Scarfo's presence lingered on them like a weight, like a shadow that would always be there, watching. Scarfo wasn't born to this life. He had come from a humble beginning in Brooklyn, where his father worked as a shoemaker. But the streets had their own rules, and Scarfo learned quickly that power wasn't about size, it was about making others see you before you saw them. Scarfo wasn't big, but he was sharp. He was relentless. And by the time he moved to Philadelphia, he knew how to survive. Scarfo wasn't interested in being loved, he was interested in being feared. Years spent watching the rise of men like Angelo Bruno had taught Scarfo one key lesson: power doesn't always come with violence. Sometimes, it came in silence. Bruno, the gentle don, ruled with a quiet hand. Scarfo, however, learned to use that silence against him. He was patient, calculating. Every decision, every small move was part of a plan that Scarfo knew would eventually bring him to the top. But even Scarfo, who had always trusted his instincts, was starting to feel the weight of his decisions. Atlantic City was growing, yes, but so was the threat that one misstep would lead to everything falling apart. Scarfo had always been one step ahead, but now, he was feeling the heat. His empire had started with a few strategic moves, but as the stakes grew higher, so did the cost. The money, the power, it was all his, but it came with a price. And the man who had built this empire in silence was starting to hear whispers he couldn't ignore. As Scarfo walked the boardwalk, his mind wasn't on the city's prosperity. It was on the growing sense of unease that he couldn't shake. How long could he stay on top? Would the very fear that kept him in power eventually turn against him? The question swirled, but Scarfo didn't show it. He never did. After all, in his world, power was a game, and Scarfo always played to win. But winning wasn't always guaranteed. The night was cold, but Scarfo's mind burned with a restless energy. He had built his empire on fear and loyalty, but as the days went by, the lines between the two began to blur. The men who once followed him without question were beginning to ask questions of their own. Scarfo had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the rules. But in his isolation, he began to see cracks forming, not just in the city, but in his own operations. Scarfo didn't trust easily. Loyalty was his most prized asset, something he demanded without hesitation from the men around him. But loyalty wasn't something that could be demanded forever. It was a fragile thing, and Scarfo was starting to realize that it could only stretch so far before it snapped. He had spent years building a network of men who would die for him, but now he found himself questioning if they would ever do more than that. Would they stand by him when the world he had created started to crumble? One evening, Scarfo sat across from his nephew, Phil Leonetti, at a small, dimly lit diner tucked away from the casino noise. Scarfo had always trusted Leonetti. Phil had been with him since the beginning. Scarfo had taken him under his wing, showing him the ropes of the family business. Phil was loyal, no doubt about it. But loyalty was a currency Scarfo didn't have the luxury of taking for granted anymore. Scarfo didn't talk much, but when he did, his words always carried weight. "Phil," Scarfo said, his voice low but firm, "you ever think about how we got here?" Leonetti shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What do you mean?" "The city's changing. The casinos, the money, it's all growing. But every time I turn my head, it feels like someone's trying to take something from me. I built this, but it's like I'm standing on a cliff, waiting for the wind to blow me off." Leonetti paused, his gaze shifting downward. He'd heard the rumors, the whispers from other men, the quiet discussions about Scarfo's growing paranoia. But he didn't say anything. Scarfo had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to read people. But lately, Scarfo had seemed different. There was a tension about him, something that felt off. Leonetti couldn't help but wonder if his uncle was starting to lose his grip on things. Scarfo leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing. He looked out the window at the neon lights flashing in the distance, the reflection of the city's fast-paced, ever-changing skyline blurring in his mind. "Phil, you don't think someone's coming for me, do you?" Leonetti hesitated. He wasn't sure what Scarfo meant by coming for me. Was it just the usual paranoia, or had Scarfo started seeing threats that weren't really there? "No, Uncle," Leonetti said carefully. "No one's coming for you. You've got everything under control. Always have." But Scarfo didn't seem convinced. "You sure about that?" Phil wasn't sure anymore. The loyalty Scarfo had commanded all these years wasn't something Leonetti could just hand out anymore. Scarfo's rule had become unpredictable. The violence, the control, the isolation, Phil saw it, felt it. Scarfo's empire wasn't as secure as it seemed. They sat there for a long moment, the silence heavy between them. Scarfo's gaze didn't leave the window, but Phil could see the storm inside his uncle's mind. Scarfo had always been a man who relied on loyalty, but now, as Scarfo's world grew larger, so did the fear that one wrong move would bring it all down. Loyalty had been the glue that held Scarfo's empire together, but as the years wore on, Scarfo realized that loyalty alone wasn't enough. People were beginning to question him. And when those doubts started creeping in, Scarfo knew he couldn't keep ignoring them forever. "You've always been loyal, Phil," Scarfo finally said, breaking the silence. "I just hope you always will be." Phil swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what his uncle meant by that, but he could feel the weight of the words. Scarfo had always been a man of few words, but those few words always meant something. And as much as Phil wanted to believe that loyalty would be enough to keep them both safe, a small voice inside him began to wonder how much longer that loyalty would last. Scarfo had built his empire on fear, but now, it seemed that fear was starting to consume him. By 1980, Atlantic City was no longer the decaying, forgotten place it had once been. The arrival of legalized casinos had transformed it into a glittering empire, a city where fortunes could be made overnight. The streets were filled with the clatter of slot machines, the smell of cigar smoke, and the electric hum of neon lights. It was a place of endless opportunity, but also one where the stakes were higher than ever. For Scarfo, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He had spent years building his empire with quiet precision, using his understanding of people and his ability to manipulate the underworld to gain control over the city's key industries. But now, with the rapid growth of the casino industry, Scarfo saw the landscape changing. The city was shifting beneath his feet, and he had to move faster than ever to keep up. The casino boom was a gold rush, and Scarfo had already placed his bets. But the more the city grew, the more competition he faced. There were new players in town, unscrupulous businessmen, politicians, and others looking to cash in on the city's newfound wealth. Scarfo had no problem with competition, in fact, he thrived in it. But what concerned him was the shift in the dynamics. The old ways, the ones he had used to build his power, weren't as effective anymore. The game was changing, and Scarfo had to adapt, or he'd be left behind. At first, Scarfo didn't see the problem. He continued to make his usual moves, controlling unions, managing construction contracts, and keeping his fingers in every pie he could find. He was still the man to see if you wanted a piece of the action in Atlantic City. But as the years passed, Scarfo started to notice something he hadn't before. He began to feel like the very fear he had used to control the city was starting to turn against him. The men who had once looked up to him as a father figure, who had sworn loyalty to him with their lives, were now questioning his decisions. Scarfo's once unshakable confidence was beginning to falter, and the walls he had carefully built around himself started to feel like they were closing in. Scarfo had always known that in this world, nothing lasted forever, but he had never imagined that his own men, the ones he trusted most, would be the ones to bring his empire to its knees. It wasn't just about money anymore. Scarfo had all the money he could ever need. It was about control, about keeping his power and ensuring that no one could ever take it from him. And yet, as the casino industry boomed, Scarfo found himself being pushed aside, his power slowly diluted by new players who were making moves in the open, while Scarfo's world remained locked in shadows. One evening, Scarfo sat in his office above the casino, staring out at the city lights below. He had built all of this, the empire, the respect, the fear. But now, it felt like it was all slipping away. The men he had relied on for years were growing restless. They wanted more. They wanted the same power he had, the same respect, the same fear. Scarfo had always been one step ahead, but now, he found himself wondering how long he could keep playing this game. And then there was Phil Leonetti. Scarfo's nephew had been loyal, yes, but recently, Scarfo had started to see a change in him. The quiet moments between them, once filled with trust, were now filled with silence, the kind that made Scarfo uneasy. Leonetti had always been sharp, but now Scarfo wondered if his loyalty was starting to waver. He couldn't afford that. Scarfo didn't trust easily, but he had always trusted Phil. And the thought that his nephew might be questioning him now was enough to make his stomach churn. Loyalty, Scarfo muttered to himself. It had always been his currency, the thing that kept his empire intact. But now, it felt like the very thing that was going to tear it apart. The whispers had started. Not just about Leonetti, but about Scarfo himself. Men were beginning to talk. They said Scarfo was losing his touch. They said he was becoming too paranoid, too unpredictable. Scarfo couldn't let it happen. He couldn't afford to be seen as weak. But the more he tried to tighten his grip, the more it seemed like his world was slipping through his fingers. The city was changing, and Scarfo, for the first time in years, wasn't sure he could keep up. The turning point came when Scarfo least expected it. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, nor was it a sudden clash that sparked everything. It was subtle, like a quiet ripple in a calm sea before the storm. Scarfo had spent his life cultivating loyalty, but as time passed, his once unshakable trust began to feel like a curse. It started with Phil Leonetti. Scarfo's nephew had been his right hand, the one person he trusted without question. The man who had risen alongside him, shared the victories, and bore the weight of the empire together. But recently, Scarfo noticed small changes in Phil. He didn't quite look him in the eye as much. He wasn't as eager to take orders. Scarfo's sharp instincts began to itch with the feeling that something wasn't right, but he couldn't place it. Paranoia had become a constant companion, and now it was clouding his judgment. It wasn't an overnight shift. Leonetti didn't immediately turn on him. But Scarfo could see the subtle signs. In private meetings, Leonetti was less engaged, his answers were clipped, and when Scarfo asked about the men working in the family business, Leonetti would simply shrug. It was the first sign of distance. Scarfo knew what that meant. He tried not to show it. He tried not to let on how uncomfortable it made him to have his closest ally drifting away. But Scarfo knew, betrayal wasn't something that happened all at once. It was a slow process, a quiet erosion of trust, one small decision at a time. And now, Scarfo's greatest fear had begun to feel too real. One evening, Scarfo called Phil to a private meeting. They met at a small, dimly lit bar on the edge of the city, away from the eyes of anyone who might be watching. Scarfo was seated at a corner booth, his face hard, his eyes scanning every movement in the room. He didn't like being vulnerable. And tonight, for the first time, he felt it. The silence between him and his nephew was thick. "Phil," Scarfo said, leaning forward, his voice low but direct. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. You're not the same." Leonetti didn't immediately respond. He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. Scarfo could see the change. It was subtle, but it was there. "You know I've always had your back, Uncle," Leonetti said, finally meeting Scarfo's gaze, but there was no warmth in his eyes. Just distance. Scarfo's stomach turned, but he didn't show it. He had learned long ago not to show weakness. "That's the problem," Scarfo replied, his voice low, a slight edge to it. "You used to be my shadow. Now, I can't trust you. And if I can't trust you, who can I trust?" Leonetti didn't flinch. He didn't back down. The change in him was obvious now, and it hurt Scarfo in a way he didn't expect. Scarfo had raised him, taught him the rules of the game. But somewhere along the way, Phil had changed. Maybe it was the money, maybe it was the growing power. Or maybe it was the pressure of Scarfo's growing paranoia. But Scarfo could see the gap widening. The betrayal wasn't verbal yet. It was still unspoken, lingering in the silence between them. But Scarfo could feel it. He could see that Leonetti was no longer the loyal soldier he had once been. He was becoming something else, something Scarfo didn't understand. Something dangerous. "I'm loyal, Uncle." "You know that," Leonetti said, but there was something in his tone that made Scarfo question his sincerity. Loyalty. That word had always been Scarfo's foundation, but now, it felt hollow. Was Leonetti's loyalty really enough to hold this empire together? Scarfo's mind raced. If he couldn't trust Phil, who could he trust? The people who worked for him? The soldiers and his crew? Or was everyone just waiting for him to slip, waiting for the moment when Scarfo's empire finally came crashing down? The conversation ended without resolution. Leonetti left without another word. Scarfo sat there for a long time, staring at the empty glass in front of him. The room was silent, but inside his head, the noise was deafening. Scarfo knew what was coming, even if he didn't want to admit it. The cracks in his empire had already started to form, and the worst part? He couldn't stop them. He was losing control. By the time 1981 rolled around, Scarfo's empire, which had once seemed indestructible, was beginning to show signs of wear. The neon lights of Atlantic City had become more than just symbols of wealth, they had become warnings, flashing reminders of the pressure Scarfo was under. The city was growing rapidly, its casinos expanding, its economy booming, and yet Scarfo felt more like a spectator in his own kingdom. For a man who had built everything with silence, it felt like the world around him was getting too loud. Too chaotic. Too unpredictable. Scarfo had always known how to control the people around him. He had built his empire on loyalty, on fear, and on a cold, calculating precision. But as the city grew, so did the number of people who wanted a piece of it, men who wanted power, who didn't care about the old ways. They were younger, bolder, and perhaps, just a little more reckless. Scarfo's usual tactics weren't as effective anymore. The men who once followed him without question were starting to question everything. In the middle of the city's rapid expansion, Scarfo started to pull back. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first arrived in Atlantic City. The paranoia that had once been his shield was now becoming a cage. He didn't trust anyone, not even his most trusted men. His grip on power, once absolute, now felt fragile. Scarfo had spent his life building his reputation, his empire, but now, the very things he had used to control others, fear, intimidation, loyalty, seemed to be losing their power. It wasn't just the city that was changing. Scarfo's men were changing too. Leonetti had been the first to show signs of discontent, but he wasn't alone. Even his closest lieutenants, men who had been with him since the beginning, were starting to question his decisions. Scarfo's increasing irrationality had alienated them. The isolation he had once used to control them now left him alone. Unapproachable. The more Scarfo withdrew, the more his empire fractured. He began to see shadows in every corner, enemies behind every smile. And yet, the more he tried to assert control, the more his men began to distance themselves. It was a vicious cycle. Scarfo's power had always come from his ability to read people, to know who would betray him and who wouldn't. But now, he couldn't see the betrayal that was coming from the men who had once sworn to protect him. It wasn't just Leonetti's questioning that bothered him, it was the silent rebellion that was bubbling just beneath the surface. Men weren't saying much, but Scarfo could feel it. He could sense the tension in the air. The loyalty was gone, replaced by doubt. And that was the scariest thing for Scarfo, because once doubt crept in, it was impossible to control. Scarfo tried to reassert his dominance. He increased the pressure on his crew, made more threats, flexed his muscles in front of those who might still be loyal. But it was clear now that the city, and his empire, had grown too large for him to control with brute force alone. The world around him had changed, and Scarfo had not adapted. The people he had once ruled with fear were now moving in different directions, each one carving out their own piece of Atlantic City. For Scarfo, the hardest part wasn't that people were starting to question him. It was that he couldn't figure out who had already turned against him. He was losing his grip on reality, unable to distinguish friend from foe. His empire was built on loyalty, but loyalty was fading, replaced by fear that Scarfo himself was becoming a shadow of the man he once was. In a final desperate attempt to hold on to control, Scarfo ordered an increase in pressure on the unions, pushing his men harder, making them work longer hours, threatening those who didn't comply. The fear he had used to keep his empire together was now his last line of defense. But it wasn't working. His men were breaking, his empire was splintering, and Scarfo, once the most feared man in Atlantic City, was now struggling to maintain control of even his closest allies. He had built an empire of fear, but now that fear was starting to consume him. The silence he had once used to his advantage had become the most dangerous thing of all. Scarfo could feel the walls closing in, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the inevitable. His empire was falling apart from the inside, and Scarfo was powerless to stop it. By the summer of 1981, the cracks in Scarfo's empire had widened into undeniable chasms. The city, once his to command, had grown faster than even he could manage. The booming casino industry, the influx of new players in the game, and the shifting loyalty among his own men were all conspiring against him. Scarfo had always been able to read people, to anticipate their every move, but now he found himself blindsided. He was no longer the feared boss who held the city in his palm, now, he was a man scrambling to keep what little he had left. The transformation in Scarfo was unmistakable. Where once he had been sharp, calculating, and always in control, now he was erratic, unpredictable, and increasingly paranoid. The men he had trusted most were starting to see the change in him. They noticed the way he seemed to snap more easily, how he isolated himself from the very people who had helped him climb to the top. It wasn't just the paranoia anymore, Scarfo's judgment had become clouded, and his once iron grip on the family was loosening. The turning point came when Scarfo, in a fit of paranoia, ordered the execution of a trusted soldier over what seemed like a minor infraction. It wasn't the first time Scarfo had made such a call, but this time it was different. The man he ordered killed had been with him for years, a loyal soldier who had never questioned Scarfo. But Scarfo didn't trust him anymore, not after hearing rumors, after the whispers of betrayal that had crept into his mind. And in Scarfo's world, if there was even a hint of disloyalty, it had to be crushed. No questions asked. But Scarfo didn't see what was coming. The execution, which had been intended to send a message, did the opposite. It sent ripples through his organization. His men, once loyal to the end, began to question if Scarfo was still the man they had followed. They had always known him as a leader who would do whatever it took to protect the family, but now, they saw him as someone driven by fear, a man willing to destroy his own in order to maintain control. The whispers started turning into open murmurs. Men began to question Scarfo's judgment, his decisions, his sanity. It wasn't just his enemies who were starting to believe he was losing it, it was his own people. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Once Scarfo lost the loyalty of his own crew, there would be no empire left. Phil Leonetti had been the first to notice the change in Scarfo, but he wasn't the only one. Men like Salvatore Chucky Merlino, who had once been Scarfo's most trusted lieutenants, began to drift away. They still did their jobs, but the fire that once burned behind their eyes had dulled. Scarfo's paranoia had become suffocating, and it wasn't just making him harder to work with, it was making him dangerous. Leonetti, the man Scarfo had considered his heir, was becoming increasingly disillusioned. He had watched his uncle rise to power with a kind of cold, silent authority that had once been admired, but now, he was starting to see the cracks in that authority. The empire Scarfo had built on loyalty and fear was crumbling under the weight of his own insecurities. Leonetti could see it, but what scared him most was the possibility that Scarfo wasn't even aware of how far he had fallen. One evening, after the execution, Scarfo sat alone in his office above the casino, staring out over the city. The lights of Atlantic City blinked in the distance, the hum of the city a constant reminder that the world was moving forward, even if Scarfo wasn't. He knew that his empire was slipping through his fingers, but he didn't know how to stop it. The fear that had once kept everyone in line now felt like it was eating away at him. He had built his power on loyalty, but that loyalty was fading, and there was nothing Scarfo could do to bring it back. Scarfo had always believed that power was something you could control, but now he was beginning to understand that it wasn't the city, the casinos, or even the men who worked for him that he had lost control over. It was himself. His paranoia, his fears, his own growing insecurities, those were the things that had torn his empire apart. The fear that had once been his greatest weapon had now become his greatest weakness. The final betrayal came, not with a loud crash or a violent outburst, but with a quiet, cold realization. Scarfo had built an empire, yes, but it was built on something fragile, something that could shatter the moment trust was lost. And in the end, it was his own blood that would betray him. Phil Leonetti had been Scarfo's shadow for years. The young man, whom Scarfo had raised as a son, had been his right hand, his closest ally, the one person he believed would never turn against him. But Scarfo's growing paranoia had done more than alienate his men, it had pushed his nephew away. Leonetti, once the loyal soldier, was now questioning Scarfo's decisions, his leadership, and most importantly, his ability to stay in control. Scarfo had turned into a man who no longer trusted anyone, not even those closest to him, and it was this lack of trust that began to drive a wedge between them. Leonetti's doubts had been building for months. He had seen Scarfo's paranoia take root, the way his uncle began to make decisions based on suspicion rather than strategy. The once certain path Scarfo had walked was now clouded by uncertainty. Leonetti could feel the change. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to believe that the man who had given him everything was now losing his mind. But deep down, Leonetti knew something had to be done. Scarfo's grip on power was slipping, and he wasn't the only one who could see it. The decision to turn on Scarfo wasn't an easy one, but it was inevitable. The moment Scarfo ordered the execution of another trusted man for nothing more than a slight misstep, Leonetti saw it for what it was, a sign of desperation. Scarfo was unraveling, and Leonetti knew that if he didn't act soon, he'd be caught in the storm of his uncle's downfall. The FBI had been watching Scarfo for years, piecing together information bit by bit. They had wiretaps, informants, and evidence that tied him to countless crimes. Scarfo had been careful, yes, but in his obsession with control, he had slipped. He had trusted the wrong people, pushed away his loyal soldiers, and now, Leonetti had become their link to bringing him down. One evening, Scarfo found himself alone in his office, staring out at the city below. His empire had been built in silence, but now, all he could hear were the whispers, the ones he couldn't escape. He had always been in control, always been the one who made the final call. But tonight, the silence felt different. It felt like an omen, like the walls were closing in. Then the call came. "Uncle, it's done," Leonetti said, his voice calm but cold. Scarfo's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud still shook him to his core. The words hung in the air, final, undeniable. Leonetti had turned. And Scarfo, the man who had once controlled the city with a look, a threat, was powerless to stop it. Phil Leonetti wasn't the only one who had made a deal. The whispers in Scarfo's ranks had turned into an avalanche of betrayal. Merlino, Salvi, and others, men who had once been Scarfo's inner circle, were now working with the FBI. The web of lies and deceit had been woven so tightly that Scarfo didn't even know who to trust anymore. His world, once ruled by fear, was now crumbling under the weight of his own paranoia. Scarfo sat there in the dark, alone in his thoughts. He had always believed in loyalty, in keeping those around him close. But now, even his closest allies were gone. The empire he had built on fear and silence was slipping through his fingers. And worse, he knew there was no way to stop it. It was too late for Scarfo. His once loyal soldiers had turned, and the law was closing in. The FBI had their case, and with Leonetti's cooperation, there was no escaping the inevitable. Scarfo's empire, which had once seemed untouchable, was now just a shadow of its former self. He was no longer the feared Don of Atlantic City. He was a man who had lost everything, even his own family. The final betrayal was not just about Scarfo's downfall, it was the moment he realized the price of the power he had fought so hard to protect. Scarfo had ruled with fear for so long, but now, that fear had turned against him. And as he sat there, waiting for his fate to be sealed, Scarfo knew one thing for certain: the empire was lost, and his legacy would be one of paranoia and betrayal. The indictment came quickly, but Scarfo had seen the signs long before the feds had moved in. By the time the FBI presented their case, the cracks in his empire had already shattered the surface. Scarfo wasn't blind to the warnings, his intuition had always been his greatest asset. But even his sharp instincts couldn't save him now. It wasn't the sudden chaos that caught Scarfo off guard. No, it was the quiet nature of it all, the way it crept up on him, piece by piece. He had always been the one pulling the strings, the one who controlled the flow of information, the one who made sure everything happened on his terms. But now, the strings were slipping through his fingers, and for the first time, Scarfo wasn't in control. It wasn't the hitmen, the politicians, or even the competition that were his undoing. It was the very men he had trusted most, the ones who had once been his closest allies, now turned informants. Scarfo's paranoia had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more he pushed people away, the more isolated he became. And the more isolated he became, the more vulnerable he was to the very betrayal he had feared all along. His inner circle had fractured, and with it, his grip on the family. The FBI, with Leonetti's testimony and evidence gathered over the years, had what they needed to bring him down. Scarfo's name had been synonymous with power, but now it was synonymous with downfall. The trial began, and Scarfo, once the man who ruled with iron silence, found himself sitting in a courtroom with no way to escape the reality of what was happening. He had always been a man of action, a man who never sat still. But now, he was forced to sit in a room full of strangers, staring at a judge who held his fate in his hands. For the first time in his life, Scarfo wasn't the one calling the shots. He was at the mercy of a system he had always considered beneath him, a system he had always managed to manipulate. But no more. The evidence against him was overwhelming: wiretaps, testimony from his closest men, and the mounting pile of incriminating documents. Scarfo had always been careful, always kept his hands clean in public. But it didn't matter anymore. He was guilty, and the truth had caught up with him. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, Scarfo sat there, unmoving. He wasn't shocked. He had known it was coming. It was the inevitable end to a life built on lies, deceit, and violence. But even then, there was a flicker of defiance in his eyes. Scarfo didn't break. He didn't beg. He didn't show weakness. He had lived his life a certain way, and even in defeat, he refused to let anyone see the man behind the power. As Scarfo was escorted out of the courtroom, the once feared Don of Atlantic City was now just another convicted felon. The city he had once ruled with an iron fist was now moving forward without him. The casinos, the businesses, the unions, everything Scarfo had worked for was now being carved up by those who had been loyal to him and by new players who were eager to fill the void left by his absence. But what hurt Scarfo most wasn't the loss of his empire, his wealth, or even his freedom. It was the loss of respect. For years, Scarfo had been the one everyone feared, the one everyone bowed to. But now, he was just another name in the prison system, a once great man brought low by his own paranoia, his own fear. And yet, even as he was sentenced to 14 years in prison, Scarfo still held on to the belief that he could reclaim his empire. It wasn't just about money or control anymore, it was about his legacy. He had spent a lifetime building something, and he wasn't ready to see it all slip away just yet. But the prison walls, though not visible to the public eye, were already closing in. Scarfo's time had come. His empire had fallen, and there would be no coming back from it. The fear he had once used to command respect had now become the source of his downfall. In the end, it wasn't Scarfo's rivals or his competition that did him in, it was his own inability to trust anyone, his own paranoia that had eaten him alive from the inside out. The walls of the prison were cold, sterile, and unforgiving, much like Scarfo had once been to everyone around him. As he settled into his new life, away from the power, the fear, and the city that had once bowed to him, he realized just how far he had fallen. The very empire that had made him a feared name was now nothing more than a distant memory, fading as time moved on without him. Inside the concrete walls, Scarfo's mind was still sharp. He hadn't forgotten how to maneuver in the world of crime, but now, his influence didn't extend beyond the prison gates. His phone calls, his letters, and the few contacts he could rely on couldn't restore the power he once had. The world had moved on, leaving Scarfo behind. His name, once spoken in reverence, was now just a shadow of what it had been. The old Don, who had once controlled every aspect of Atlantic City, now sat in a small cell with nothing but his thoughts for company. The silence of the prison was louder than any of the whispers he used to command. His mind, which had once been a weapon, now seemed like his greatest enemy. The fear that had served him so well throughout his life now haunted him, but not in the way it once had. Now, the fear was about his legacy, about being forgotten, and about the growing realization that he might never be relevant again. In the first few months of his sentence, Scarfo tried to maintain his old persona. He made connections within the prison system, trying to surround himself with those who might still fear him. He made deals, kept his presence known, and even from behind bars, he tried to hold on to the reputation he had built. But the walls kept closing in, and soon, Scarfo realized that even the prison world had changed. His name no longer held the same weight. Men who once feared him now saw him as a relic of a bygone era, a man out of touch with the modern world of crime. Phil Leonetti, his own nephew, had become a major factor in the case that sealed Scarfo's fate. Scarfo had seen it coming, but the sting of betrayal was still sharp. Leonetti had not only turned on him but had become the very thing Scarfo had always feared, a man who was smarter, more adaptable, and willing to do what Scarfo could no longer do. Scarfo had taught him everything, but Leonetti had surpassed him. And Scarfo had no one to blame but himself. As the months turned into years, Scarfo's anger began to fade. What remained was a hollow feeling, a sense of time slipping away. The world that had once belonged to him was now out of reach. The respect, the power, the fear, all of it had dissolved into the noise of the modern world. No one feared Scarfo anymore. No one even remembered him the way they once had. His name had been replaced by newer figures in the world of organized crime, men who were more ruthless, more dangerous, and better equipped to navigate the shifting tides. Scarfo didn't have the luxury of nostalgia. The streets of Atlantic City, once his playground, had moved on. The casinos continued to thrive, but Scarfo's fingerprints were nowhere to be found. The unions, the construction deals, the backdoor agreements, everything that had once been his domain was now controlled by other men. His empire, built on loyalty and fear, had crumbled, leaving him a shadow of the man he used to be. Prison didn't change Scarfo, but it did reveal how irrelevant he had become. He wasn't the Don of Atlantic City anymore. He wasn't the man who could make or break someone's life with a nod. He was just another inmate, another old gangster who had outlived his usefulness. And as the years passed, Scarfo came to terms with the truth: he was no longer the man who had once ruled Atlantic City. He was a ghost of the past, a cautionary tale about the dangers of paranoia, the cost of loyalty, and the price of power. The world had moved on without him, and there was nothing Scarfo could do to change that. His legacy, once full of promise and fear, had become nothing more than a whisper in the wind. When Nicodemo Scarfo passed away in prison in 2017, it was a quiet affair. The once feared Don, whose name had been synonymous with control, loyalty, and fear, was buried in the shadows of the same prison walls that had confined him for so many years. There were no grand ceremonies, no lines of mourners, no tributes from the powerful figures he had once ruled over. Scarfo's death marked the final end of an era, but it was one that had already been forgotten by most. The world had moved on, and Scarfo was left as nothing more than a footnote in the history of organized crime, a tragic figure who had once been king, but had died in silence, just like the empire he built. For those who had known him during his rise, Scarfo remained a symbol of what power could achieve. He had been the man who ruled Atlantic City with an iron fist, the one who commanded loyalty through fear and manipulation. Scarfo had shaped the city's underworld, turning it into a machine that ran on silence, money, and calculated violence. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than anything else. In the world Scarfo built, you didn't need to shout to be heard, you just needed to be feared. And Scarfo had mastered that art. But in the end, it was that same fear that led to his downfall. His need to control everything and everyone had turned him into a paranoid shell of the man he had once been. The empire he had spent years building slowly unraveled, not from external enemies, but from within. His own men, the very ones he had trusted most, turned on him. Phil Leonetti, the nephew he had raised like a son, became a key figure in the effort to bring Scarfo down. Leonetti, once Scarfo's shadow, now became the one to carry the weight of his uncle's betrayal. Scarfo had always known that loyalty was the foundation of his empire, but in the end, it was that very loyalty that crumbled beneath him. As Scarfo sat alone in his prison cell, reflecting on his life, he must have realized that the legacy he had worked so hard to build had already begun to fade. His once legendary reign was now a story told in whispers, a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of power could turn into the very thing that destroyed you. His name was still recognized in certain circles, but in the grand scheme of things, Scarfo had become a relic of a bygone era. The new generation of crime bosses, men like John Gotti, for example, had taken the reins of organized crime, and Scarfo's influence had faded into obscurity. Scarfo's life was a paradox. He had been a man of great power, yet in the end, his fear of losing it had cost him everything. His empire had been built on manipulation and intimidation, but in the end, those tools had become his undoing. The very silence that had once given him strength now left him isolated, unable to connect with the men he had once trusted. And as the years passed, Scarfo became nothing more than a symbol of how even the most powerful men can be brought down by their own paranoia. Scarfo's legacy would forever be marked by the fact that he could never trust anyone, not even those closest to him. His empire, once filled with loyalty and respect, had crumbled into mistrust, fear, and betrayal. He had spent his life building something that, in the end, wasn't as solid as he had believed. The lessons of Scarfo's rise and fall are clear: trust is fleeting, loyalty is fragile, and power, no matter how absolute, is never permanent. As Scarfo's name faded from the public's memory, his story remained a quiet reminder of how paranoia can destroy even the greatest of empires. His life was a lesson about the dangers of relying too heavily on fear to rule, the cost of betraying those around you, and the fragile nature of loyalty. Scarfo may have been feared, but in the end, it was the fear he created that took everything from him. And so, Scarfo passed into history, not with a roar, but with a whisper, like the silence that had once served him so well. His name, once a symbol of power, was now just another story told in the shadows of organized crime. If you enjoyed this story of Scarfo's rise and tragic fall, make sure to hit like and subscribe for more captivating gangster tales. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Did Scarfo's paranoia truly bring him down, or was it something else? Your feedback means a lot and helps shape the content you want to see. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more Mafia stories coming soon.